We looked at many opening sequences of horrors to gain an idea of some of the conventions of movies of the same subgenre, slasher and psychological horrors. These films included industrial films such as Woman in Black and independent films such as Saw.
We learned a great deal from these tasks, such as some of the main props and prosthetics used in slasher films like blood and offensive-looking weaponry. This helped us to plan our opening and make it recognisably a horror film, whereas in our preliminary task, we did not have the same time to look into other films.
Another thing we learned from watching the multiple openings was how to integrate titles into our opening scene, allowing us to see how they position on the screen and the font they're in, so we could use similar effects in our opening.
We also looked at the mise-en-scène, camera work and sound in our final task research to see what helped to make the film recognisable as horror. This helped provide us with ideas that we thought professional films would use effectively that we could imitate in our opening. As we could not conduct research like this for our preliminary task, our opening sequence was much more advanced in terms of sound, mise-en-scène and camera work.
Our storyboarding of our preliminary task was nowhere near to the standard of our opening sequence. Both were originally sketched onto several frames. However, with our opening sequence, more was planned out in terms of camera movement, for example. We also put our storyboard in our opening sequence into animatic to give us an idea of how long particular shots was going to last and what sound we could use over it. As our preliminary task was mainly shot in school, we did not have to plan shoots as extensively as with the opening sequence. We planned multiple shoots in advance for our opening sequence, selecting what particular frames from our storyboard we would shoot on those days.
Our plan included booking out equipment that was needed for the shoot and signing out the equipment such as cameras, tripods and the track and dolly. And we also had to fill out risk assessment sheets for the shoots, which again gave us a greater idea of how our shoots would turn out as we were thinking about all the elements.
Our planning could have been improved because we did have very poor time management with planning tasks and the preliminary tasks. Then with the final piece, we missed the deadline due to our filming attempts going wrong due to issues with the lighting, which will be mentioned later.
Other elements of our planning that varied from a preliminary task to the opening sequence were that we had to plan ahead and prepare what props we were going to use, meaning we could obtain them and prepare them. Also, we had to fill out a location recce, allowing us to see how good the environment was for filming.
In our opening sequence, we used many different types of sound, including diegetic, non-diegetic, extra-diegetic and sound bridges to help develop our piece into recognisable suspense-building horror.
One of the most notable differences between our two pieces is a difference in backing sound, as the opening piece uses a recognisable Johnny Cash song, whereas our preliminary task uses a droning sound. They are both effective, but each their own genre of horror, as the droning sound would not have been as effective in our opening sequence.
Another notable difference is the lack of dialogue in our opening sequence, as our preliminary task had a criteria that we had to meet, which involved 2 lines of dialogue. However, with our opening sequence, dialogue does not sound as good and as clear outside, which probably would have had a negative effect on our piece. Also, integrating it successfully with the overlaying soundtrack would have been very difficult to do well.
We also recorded more interesting and effective sound effects ourselves for the opening sequence, such as the banging on the shadows in the preliminary task. We used more sound effects, such as heavy breathing, and the only real one we recorded ourselves was the closing of the doors. Continuity editing was used throughout the opening, but there was some intercutting between me doing the gardening and the tracking shot of the shed. Each time the tracking shot came on screen, you could hear the sound of the protagonist moaning, as well as the horror drone we downloaded from Freesound. Sequencing was the easiest part of the editing stage, as we had thoroughly planned the shots we were going to film, so we knew what order they had to be in, and we had a wide range of angles and distances we could choose from. Continuity editing was also used in our preliminary tasks, so we knew what we were doing and how we were going to film it, but the preliminary task was over a minute shorter than the final opening, so we had to film more.
The time stretch tool was used to reduce the length of the long exposure of the clouds. Originally it was over 5 minutes long, but reduced it down to 5 seconds. This shot was used to show time passing whilst Anthony was in the shed. This leaves the audience in suspense, as they cannot see what is going on in the shed. And when he comes out, he has blood on his chest, so it leaves the audience guessing as to what has happened. The 180-degree rule was used both in the preliminary task and the final piece. This stops the audience from becoming disorientated and becoming confused as to where the character is.
As mentioned previously, we did not adjust the light settings because we filmed in the correct conditions for our opening. We did use fade in and fade out tool, and the main title came on because without it there was a jump from a black screen straight back into our film. The fade tool was used at the end as well. We tried not to overuse it though, because fading in and out of shots is not conventional in horror films.
In terms of conventions, our narrative is quite typical of the horror genre, as there is a strong white male antagonist who has sadistically planned to kill the protagonist.
The main part of our storyline that is perhaps unconventional is that the victim is male and not the typical damsel in distress or small child that's present in most horror films. Even though he is not seen, the extra diegetic sound of him groaning in the shed shows he's male.
We used the school cameras when filming. These are Panasonic HDC SD60 cameras, which filmed in full HD. They were good when filmed in the light, but when it came to the dark, they were not as good. The tracking dolly was used a couple of times in Forget Me Not. The main time it was used was a tracking shot of the shed when I was walking across the garden. This was effective as we were able to track in at a steady speed without it looking shaky.
For every frame on our storyboard we had to film, we used a wide range of camera shots, angles and distances. Each of these were done multiple times, but we had to get it right due to numerous times we'd previously gone wrong. This was the same in the preliminary task. We went wrong and we had to film it again, so we used a wider range of shots. This is why we did this in the final piece, just in case something went wrong with a certain shot. We had different ones we could use instead.
My costume in Forget Me Not was conventional of a gardener. I had gardening gloves which I didn't actually wear during the filming because I was unable to get them on, tracksuit bottoms, a vest and a pair of wellies. The costume I was wearing made me look normal in terms of the low middle class society. This was important in our piece because I was meant to look normal in the opening until the tracking shots of the shed.
And the location of our scene also implies that Anthony, who's called Tony in the film, is of the lower middle class, as he's in a large garden and therefore it's assumed he has a large house to match the garden. This is then reinforced by the side of the house which is shown, as you can see a set of double doors which connote that he lives in a big house.
The props used in the opening reinforce the fact that Anthony is going to do some gardening. The gloves could be considered as props as he never actually wore them, but he was holding them up until the digging scene. When he is digging the hole, he has a shovel and a digging fork, as well as gardening tools. He has a rope which is then tied around a tree in a hangman's noose. This creates suspense as the audience are unaware as to why the noose has been tied because they think Anthony is just doing some gardening. Then when he gets into the shed, he picks up an axe, which can be considered as a phallic symbol.
In terms of lighting, there is no artificial lighting in Forget Me Not as it is filmed outside during the day, which is what we wanted, so we did not have to change the contrast or reduce the brightness on our shots. However, the reason we changed our concept was due to issues with lighting. We tried using fiddler lights when filming in the dark, but the cameras did not pick up any detail because of the poor resolution, and when it did, the footage was grainy. We used various techniques when trying to light up the dark areas, such as candles which give off soft light, but this failed. This led us to changing our concept and we came up with Forget Me Not.
There's only one character in Forget Me Not who the audience are able to see, but there's two characters. There's Tony and there's the character who's tied up in the shed, and you can hear him moaning when the tracking shot of the shed is on. Tony is the antagonist, but his costume suggests something else, as he's wearing normal gardening clothes. Harry, the man who is tied up in the shed, is the protagonist, but he is not shown to the audience. And the diversity of soundtrack vary greatly between the preliminary task and the opening sequence, as we have much more time and experience to experiment with sound and use different types and see what worked best.
We decided early on in the planning process that we wanted Tony to be perceived as the audience as a relatively normal at first, to add an element of shock value to the opening when he is eventually shown to be a cold, sadistic killer.
Basically, our storyline starts with me looking like a normal lower middle class person, relaxing at his house with a cup of tea and his phone, creating the illusion of normality. Then I get up and pick up some rope, but it's still not clear as to what I'm doing with it, so I still look normal. It's only when I walk away from the tree that the noose is tied is shown, showing something's not quite right.
As it becomes clearer that Tony is the antagonist, he starts digging a shallow grave, which further implies he's about to kill someone. We then see him start walking away from the grave before intercutting to the shed, where you can hear Harry, the victim, groaning and trying to scream through a gag. And then a drone is played at the same time as a shed is shown to add a greater sense of unease and distortion to the scene.
Tony then goes into the shed and picks up an axe, closes the door and kills Harry, which the audience don't see, but the silencing of his groans and the sound of axe against the shed ensures that the audience knows what's happened. This is then reinforced by the way Anthony comes out with the blood across his chest.
The killing is shown to be particularly sadistic and distorted through the shot from a canted angle, and then again as I come out of the shed looking nonchalant and totally normal, creating a high degree of unease as the audience are shocked that someone who looks so normal can be so dark, before finally the scene finishes the tracking shot away from the shed and away from the brutal murder scene.